Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural podcast of Lashed in the Mast. We will begin with the philosophy portion, looking at some basic metaphysics. Then we will move on to the political section, looking at the first part of the first book of Plato's Republic, and then on to the economic section, where I will be critiquing some of the economics' um, presuppositions about how humans behave. Um, so yeah, without further ado, let's jump into the philosophy portion. Um, this philosophical portion of the podcast will examine the origin of metaphysics through the lens of three schools of thought concerning being from ancient Greece, um, and will end by explaining the first of the 24 Thomistic theses. Just as a PSA, please take time to understand the arguments presented before critiquing them. As philosophers, we really shouldn't be setting up straw men and then knocking them down. It's really important to really make an effort to understand the ideas and terms if you want to seriously engage with it, rather than taking a cursory glance and writing them all off as trite. Richard Dawkins. uh, Excuse me. Anyway, so turning to the historical origins of metaphysics, I am now going to shamelessly plagiarize Joseph Owens's An Elementary Christian Metaphysics and Ed Feser's Aristotle's Revenge before also plagiarizing Disputed Questions' defense of the first Thomistic thesis. It's only plagiarism if you get caught, am I right? The first thing to consider is the origin and meaning of the term metaphysics. According to Owens, metaphysics is derived from the Greek ta meta ta physica, which means what comes after the physical, and was used to refer to a set of works by Aristotle, a famous philosopher who lived in 4th century BC in ancient Greece, and yeah, I did mean to say BC and not BCE, which he himself referred to as primary philosophy, theology, or simply wisdom. From this definition, then, we can see that Aristotle and his followers saw metaphysics as sort of a bedrock for the other sciences, with the term after meaning what goes beyond the physical. In this way, metaphysics was seen by the Peripatetics, students of the aforementioned Aristotle, to be the study of the supersensible, meaning what goes beyond the sensible. A more modern definition of metaphysics is that metaphysics is the study of being as being. That is, it is the study of a thing from the viewpoint of its being. Now, these definitions might seem a little confusing, and they are, but here's an example to illustrate. Imagine you're a food critic who has just emerged from the drive-thru of Taco Bell, not a sponsor, and you have an order of tacos in front of you that you need to judge. How would you go about judging the taco? One way would simply be to judge the taco as a whole, by eating the whole taco all at once. Being the good food critic that you are, however, you will want to judge the ingredients as well, perhaps by taking the meat out and inspecting it or some of the lettuce, etc., etc., etc. In this way, you are not judging the whole taco at once, but rather judging a part of it as separated from, abstracted from is the technical term, the rest of the taco. Now, this is precisely what looking at a thing from the viewpoint of its being means. Metaphysics isolates being from the thing it is studying and examines it without reference to anything else that the thing has, such as its chemical makeup or extension into space. This is what is meant when we say that metaphysics is the study of being as being, meaning we abstract away from the chemical makeup of the thing, its extension into space, and just look at the slice of it that is being. Yeah, so rather than isolating meat from a taco as you would as a food critic, or isolating the mathematically quantifiable aspects of a thing as physics would, a metaphysician abstracts everything from the thing being studied except its being or existence. Another way to say this is with a really fancy word, qua, as in metaphysics is the study of being qua being. Once again, the definition of metaphysics is the study of the supersensible, meaning what goes beyond meta the sensible, or alternatively, the study of being qua or as being. The next thing to consider is the way that metaphysics originated. We started with Aristotle, we mentioned him earlier in the podcast, but the first metaphysician was actually Parmenides of Elea in the 5th century BC. He argued that change was impossible, since for anything to change would require something already existing to give way to something that until now was not existent. And since something can't come from nothing, that means change must be impossible. Parmenides' student Zeno reinforced Parmenides' idiosyncratic position, which is referred to as static monism, with some famous paradoxes. In one paradox, known as the dichotomy paradox, a runner is attempting to move from point A to point B. However, traveling the distance to B would require traveling half the distance to B, and this in turn requires you to traverse half the distance to B, and so on ad infinitum. Due to this regress, therefore, travel to B must be impossible as well as change in general. On the complete opposite side of things, and also around the same time as Parmenides, interestingly enough, Heraclitus held that there was no such thing as being, but only becoming, i.e. permanence never arises since everything is always changing, literally the exact opposite position of the one that Parmenides and Zeno had. For example, Heraclitus held that there is no such thing as the self that persists through time, but only a jumble of atoms constantly in flux that give the impression of permanence. This position in turn is known as dynamic monism, as opposed to the static monism mentioned earlier. So the static monism is associated with Parmenides, who argued that change is impossible, who argued that that change was impossible since it would involve something coming from nothing. And dynamic monism refers to Heraclitus's view that there is no such thing as being or permanence, rather all there is change. Now, both of these conclusions seem absurd, and they are, but it wasn't until Aristotle introduced the concepts of actuality, or simply act, and potency that these arguments were debunked. Act refers to the existence of a thing, while potential refers to a middle ground between pure act and nothingness that is really existence in the thing. Quoting Ed Feser from his Aristotle's Revenge, the water that makes up an ice cube is actually cold, but it is potentially liquid and potentially lukewarm. When the sun melts the ice cube into a puddle, these potentials are actualized. What change in general involves, then, is precisely that sort of thing, vis-a-vis the actualization of potential. End quote. It is important to hammer home this point that potency is a really existent feature of the world when combined with act. Here's Ed Feser again on the reality of potency. Beginning quote. Given that a potential is something really in a thing, a change to the thing involves being of one sort. In the traditional jargon, being in potency, giving rise to being of another sort, being in act, rather than non-being or nothingness giving rise to being. Let me read that again, because I kind of take a swig here. That was bad delivery. Here's Ed Feser again on the reality of potency. Given that a potential is something really in a thing, a change to the thing involves being of one sort, in the traditional jargon, being in potency, giving rise to being of another sort, being in act, rather than non-being or sheer nothingness giving rise to being. To illustrate this point, imagine once again that you are a food critic about to judge a Taco Bell taco. Also, still not a sponsor. At the moment T1 you are salivating over this taco, it exists as a taco. But supposing you apply hot sauce to the taco at the moment T2, then the taco will become a taco with hot sauce. Parmenides would say that this is impossible since the taco going from a taco at T1 to a hot taco at T2 would involve change. Under the framework of act and potency, though, the taco has a real objective potency to receive hot sauce. Being is not only act, it also includes real potency. S at T1 is actually, I forgot to, this is actually a quote from the Disputed Questions blog that I forgot to say beforehand, so quoting disputed questions now, being is not only act, it also includes real potency. S at T1 is actually F1 and potentially F2. At T2, S is now actually F2 because its potential for F2 has been made actual. So F2 does not come from either actual being or nothing, it comes from potency or potential being. S at T1 has a real objective capacity for F2. End quote. Now, that's a really confusing quote, but I'm going to read it again, this time inserting the taco as S and the hot sauce as the change that it undergoes. Okay, so once again, quoting disputed questions with our example from Taco Bell substituted in. Being is not only act, it also includes real potency. The taco at T1 is actually not a hot taco and potentially a hot taco. At T2 or the second instant, taco is now actually hot taco because its potential for hot taco has been made actual. So hot taco does not come from either actual being or nothing, or the hotness that makes the taco hot does not come from either actual being or nothing. It comes from potency or potential being. Taco at T1 at the first instance has a real objective capacity for hot taco. However, let's consider, we already went over that, so let me just find my place here. Okay, so like the good food critic you are, let's say that after applying hot sauce, you decide to throw this taco into the trash. This would actualize a different potential at T2, the potential for the taco to become garbage. Finally, if you were to take the hot taco out of the trash and eat it, that would actualize the garbage's potential at T3 to be eaten. The potential for a taco to become a hot taco, potential for a hot taco to become garbage, and potential for garbage to be eaten are all real separate objective potentialities of things that have been actualized in this case. And remember that potentialities just means a capacity inherent in the thing for something else. And that actualization means bringing that potency into being. Okay, so contra Parmenides, therefore, Aristotelianism agrees that it is impossible for something to come from nothing, but argues that that is not what change is. Rather, change is the result of actualization of potentials, really existent in the world as noted above. Returning to the dichotomy paradox, remember the first paradox from Zeno, we can now say that the distances to be traversed in between A and B are there only potentially, while the only actual distance is the one being traveled over. This response also applies to change in general, since the paradox applies to all distances. Give me a second, I just gotta take a swig. Oof, sorry. So now, in response to Heraclitus, who again believed that there were no permanent aspects to things only becoming or only change, we can now say that the capacity for change found in potency must be grounded in something already actual. Potency without any real act can't exist, since it wouldn't have anything actual to adhere to, and even if potency existed without act, there wouldn't be any actuality there to bring it into being. Parmenides and Heraclitus also had radical views on multiplicity, or complexity would be a rough approximation there. Parmenides argued that the only way to distinguish one thing from another is non-being, which is just nothing. Therefore, he argued, there are no distinct things in reality, only being unmixed. Parmenides had another assist from Zeno this time, who provided a conundrum known as the paradox of parts. Zeno argues that if there were distinct things in the universe, each of those things would have size. But since something is larger the more parts it has, distinct things must have infinite size and are the same size as each other, which is absurd. Therefore, there are no distinct things in the universe, just being. Yeah, pretty epic conclusion. hot take here. Heraclitus, in turn, argues that since nothing actual exists, there can't be unity in the universe since the universe is in a state of constant flux. This denial of abiding objects implies that there is no thing in the universe at all, but just a mass of becoming or changing. With regards to multiplicity, then, Heraclitus argues that there are radically more things or almost things. In response to Parmenides, we can respond by saying that his presupposition that being is the only way to distinguish between things is false. Once again, because he didn't take potency into account. He only had existence and non-existence. Whereas with our introduction of potency, we have act, potency, which is a real capacity for existence, and then nothing. Therefore, things can be distinguished by potency, which, as we saw earlier, is a type of being, and Parmenides' argument falls apart. Let me see how we're doing on time. Okay. In response to Zeno's paradox of parts, we can say once again that the multiplicity present in things is present there only potentially. Only when the division is actualized by something, such as a jackhammer on concrete, does the division actually exist. Finally, in response to Heraclitus, we can say that change is impossible in a world that is only potential, since potency requires being to actualize it. Whew. After all of this, then, we arrive at the Aristotelian definition of act and potency as a working theory of being, and are now ready to consider the first thesis of the 24 Thomistic Theses. As background, the 24 Thomistic Theses are a group of 24 tenets promulgated by the Sacred Congregation of Studies, part of the administration of the Pope, in 1914 that encompassed the positions held by Thomism, so named after St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century, and is the church's best philosopher and theologian. Sorry, St. Augustine. Held by Thomism, and distills them into 24 separate arguments. So there's 24 theses here that these people are saying, that the Sacred Congregation of Studies is saying you have to accept as true if you're going to be a Thomist. Without further ado, then, here is the first thesis. Potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. Again, from 24 Theses. As you can hear, we've already covered much of this thesis, and it's now time to put it all together. The thesis starts off by saying, potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists, and then ... which is an argument that potency and act completely determine the being there is, i.e., everything is some combination of potency and act. But what combination exactly? Let's look at the quote again. Whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act. We have already encountered pure act, which is simply being without any potency, and the composition of potency and act simply means that a thing is not pure act, and so that it is not pure act and therefore must have potencies to determine its being. This is what is meant by as to its primordial and intrinsic principles in the original quote. What this means further illustrate what this means, in the case of actuality mixed with potency, the actuality and the potentiality are inherent features of the thing. That is to say, an acorn has a real potency to grow into a tree, but not a real potency to grow into a giraffe. There is something inherent in the acorn that makes it grow into a tree rather than a giraffe. So pure act has been explained as well as the composition of potency in act, but why isn't there a corresponding division for pure potency? As you saw earlier, and I've been making this point throughout this podcast, in response to Heraclitus, potency can't exist without something actual bringing it into being. And since pure potency presupposes a world without actuality, there is nothing to separate pure potency from non-being. So pure potency is strictly impossible from a practical point of view, but is useful as a way of thinking about the difference between potency and act. All right, so let's give a brief overview. Let's give a brief examination of what we just looked at. Give me a second here. Okay, so there was a lot in that episode. It was really packed in, and hopefully this will distill it down into some more palatable chunks. Metaphysics is the study of the supersensible, or alternatively the study of being qua being. Remember that qua just means as. In contradistinction to both the Eleatics, who are Parmenides and Zeno, and Heraclitus, Aristotle posited two principles which constitute being: act and potency. Act refers to the existence of a thing, while potential refers to a middle ground between pure act and nothingness that is nonetheless really existent in the thing. These two principles refute the Eleatic's defense of static monism, which is essentially act with no potency, and Heraclitus's defense of dynamic monism, which can be described as potency with no act, if such a thing were possible. Instead, Aristotle's system of potency and act allow for change where change is understood as the actualization of a potential, avoiding both the pitfalls of static and dynamic monism. Finally, this section rounds off with a definition of the first Thomistic principle, that is, potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. All right, I think that pretty much concludes the philosophy section, so let's now turn over to the politics side.